What would you do if all you had left in the world were 3 worn silver dollars and a legacy of shame? If the name your father gave you was now a curse, whispered, with pity and contempt, in the one town you had nowhere else to go? For 18-year-old Fanny Boone, standing on the dusty main street of Redemption, Kansas, in the late summer of 1881, that wasn't a question. It was the price of a future. She would soon pay every cent for a rotting barn that even the crows had abandoned. But the truth buried beneath its splintered floorboards held more than shelter. It held the power to restore a name and unmake a king. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from as we tell a story of quiet courage and unexpected justice. Fanny Boone arrived in Redemption not with a flourish, but like a whisper of dust blown in on a sad wind. She led a single, sway-backed mare whose coat was the color of the road they'd traveled for weeks. The mare, named Dust, was all that remained of a herd of over 200, a sprawling ranch, and a father whose laughter used to shake the rafters of their home. Now, there was only silence. The weight of her father's recent passing was a physical thing, a heavy woolen coat in the oppressive August heat. He hadn't died of sickness, not truly. He had died of a broken spirit, the final payment on a debt called in by the wealthiest man in the county, Silas Croft. Croft's name was a venomous word on Fanny's tongue, a name she hadn't spoken aloud since she'd packed her father's last clean shirt and the tintype of her mother into a small satchel. The town of Redemption watched her pass. Faces in the windows of the mercantile, men pausing with barrels on the boardwalk, women hushing their children. They saw the Boone name in the set of her jaw, in the proud, straight line of her back that refused to slump, despite the exhaustion that pulled at her shoulders. They saw the ghost of her father, a good man who'd made a bad deal, a man who trusted Croft's handshake more than the fine print on a loan. Fanny felt their eyes, 100 tiny pricks against her skin. She didn't look at them. She looked at the notice board outside the marshal's office, her eyes scanning past postings for wanted men and lost cattle, until they landed on a small, sun-bleached square of paper. It advertised the sale of a derelict structure on the old Miller plot a mile out of town. The property was forfeit for back taxes. The structure was a barn. The price was $3. It was a sum so small it was an insult, a clear declaration of worthlessness. To Fanny, who had exactly $3 folded into a knot in her pocket, it sounded like the last door on earth. It was a place to put her head, a place to shelter Dust from the coming winter, a place to be forgotten. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward the land office, the jingle of the bell above the door sounding like a final judgment. The land office was a small, stuffy room that smelled of dry paper and stale tobacco. A thin man with spectacles perched on his nose looked up from a massive ledger. His name was Abernathy, and his gaze was professionally neutral, yet a flicker of pity crossed his face as he recognized her. "Miss Boone," he said, his voice quiet. "I've come about the Miller barn," Fanny said, her own voice startlingly rough from disuse. She placed her 3 silver dollars on the polished wood of the counter. They looked small and insufficient. Mr. Abernathy sighed, a soft exhalation of bureaucratic weariness. "Child, you don't want that place. The roof's caved in on the north side. The foundation's sinking. It's a hazard. It's worth less than the paper the deed is printed on." He pushed the coins gently back toward her. "You'd be better off using this for a week's board at the hotel." "I'll take the barn," she repeated, her voice firm. She pushed the coins back, and the deed. Her stubbornness seemed to drain the argument from him. He saw in her eyes the same unyielding pride that had led her father to his ruin. With a heavy heart, he pulled out the paperwork. The scratch of his pen was the only sound in the room. He took her money, slid the deed across the counter, and didn't meet her eyes. "It's yours," he murmured. "May God have mercy on you." As Fanny turned to leave, clutching the thin piece of paper, she heard a man at the back of the office mutter to his companion, A boon buying the miller ruin, like father, like daughter. Only a matter of time before Croft owns that too. Fanny's hand tightened on the deed until her knuckles were white. She had nothing left to lose, and that, she was beginning to understand, was its own kind of freedom. She had her horse, a single blanket, and now, a rotting monument to failure that was entirely her own. She had a place to begin. What could possibly be hidden in a place so forgotten? Was this an act of desperation, or the first step toward a justice no one saw coming? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for the rest of the story. Because as Fanny would soon learn, some floors are meant to hold more than just weight. The walk from the land office to the edge of town was the longest of Fanny's life. The deed, folded in her palm, felt both as fragile as a dead leaf and as heavy as a gravestone. Whispers followed her like flies, buzzing just at the edge of her hearing. The townspeople saw her not as a girl buying shelter, but as the final chapter in a sad, familiar story of failure. As she passed the saloon, the swinging doors opened, spilling the scent of beer and a wave of loud laughter into the street. A large man in a tailored suit and polished boots stepped out, blocking her path. It was Silas Croft. His face was florid, his eyes small and sharp. A thick gold chain was slung across his waistcoat. He looked down at Fanny, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He'd seen her leave the land office. News traveled fast in a town this small. "Well, well, Fanny Boone," he boomed, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He gestured vaguely toward the edge of town. "I hear you've made an investment, the old Miller barn." He let out a short, barking laugh. "Fitting. Your father had a taste for worthless property, too. Thought he could turn dust into gold. Look where it got him." Fanny stood perfectly still. She looked up at his face, at the self-satisfied cruelty in his eyes, and said nothing. Her silence was a wall he couldn't seem to breach. He expected tears or anger or a shouted defense of her father's name. He got none of it. He got only the flat, steady gaze of a survivor. It unnerved him. "It'll be a cold winter in that wreck," he sneered, his tone hardening. "When you're ready to sell the land for scrap, you know where to find me." He stepped aside, dismissing her as he would a fly. Fanny walked on, her boots scuffing the dusty road. She didn't look back. The heat of his stare was on her back, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing it affect her. A few doors down, sitting in a rocker on a shaded porch, was an old woman Fanny had never seen before. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky. As Fanny passed, the woman's rocking stilled. Her voice, when it came, was as dry and brittle as autumn leaves. "Some floors remember what the walls forget." The words were strange, nonsensical. Fanny paused for a half-step, glancing at the woman. The old woman, Elara Vance, simply nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion, and then resumed her gentle rocking. The cryptic phrase settled in Fanny's mind, a smooth, peculiar stone in the river of her thoughts. She didn't understand it, but she felt its weight. It was not a warning, precisely. It felt more like a key, though she couldn't imagine what lock it might fit. She left the last houses of redemption behind, the laughter of Silas Croft fading, the whispers of the town turning to silence, and the old woman's words echoing in her head. Ahead of her, the road stretched toward a lone, broken silhouette against the wide, indifferent sky, her barn. The late afternoon sun was low and gold, casting long, distorted shadows as Fanny and her mare, Dust, finally reached the property line. The barn was worse than Mr. Abernathy's description. It was a skeleton. The roof on the northern side had collapsed entirely, leaving a gaping wound open to the sky. Planks were missing from the walls like lost teeth, and the whole structure leaned to one side, as if exhausted by its long, losing battle with the wind and the rain. A profound wave of disappointment washed over Fanny, so sharp it almost buckled her knees. Croft's mocking laughter echoed in her ears. He was right. It was a ruin. It was worthless. Dust, her old mare, blew out a nervous breath. Her ears twitched a hand down the horse's bony neck. "It's all right, girl," she murmured, her voice a low comfort. "It's just for now." She led the horse toward the great sagging main doors. One had fallen from its hinges and lay half buried in the dirt. She squeezed through the opening, her eyes adjusting to the gloom inside. The air was thick with the smell of rot, of ancient hay turned to mulch, and the damp, earthy scent of a place long abandoned by the sun. It was vast and cavernous, filled with shifting shadows, and the mournful sound of the wind whistling through the thousand gaps in its walls. Beams of fading light pierced the darkness, illuminating swirling columns of dust. Debris littered the floor, broken crates, a rusted plow blade, the skeletal remains of some small animal. For a moment, the sheer hopelessness of it all threatened to swallow her. This wasn't a shelter, it was a tomb. But then her gaze fell on the far corner, the southeastern side, where the roof was mostly intact. A small section of the ground floor was relatively dry, protected from the elements. It wasn't much, but it was a start. With the last of her energy, she cleared a small space for herself and dust, pushing aside splintered wood and heaps of sodden straw. She had no bedroll, only the one thin blanket from her satchel. She laid it on the packed earth, sharing her last piece of hardtack with the mare. As darkness fell, she lay down, pulling the thin wool up to her chin. The barn groaned around her, a symphony of creaks and sighs. It sounded like a great dying beast, and in her exhaustion, Fanny felt a strange kinship with it. They were both broken, both forgotten, both left for dead. Curled on the cold ground, listening to the lonely wind, she finally slept. The first light of morning was not a gentle dawn, but a series of sharp, white blades cutting through the cracks in the barn walls. Fanny woke stiff, cold, and achingly hungry. But the despair of the previous evening had been replaced by a grim, clear-eyed resolve. There was work to do. Survival was not a feeling. It was a series of tasks. The first task was to make this corner of the barn defensible against the wind and the coming cold. She spent the morning gathering salvageable planks from the collapsed section of the roof, her hands quickly growing raw as she pried them loose. She was surprisingly strong, her muscles conditioned by years of ranch work that hadn't prepared her for polite society, but had prepared her for this. By midday, she had managed to patch the worst of the holes in her corner, creating a small, three-walled alcove that felt marginally more secure. As she worked, her eyes kept drifting upward to the hayloft. It was a shadowy expanse, a second story of decay, suspended precariously above her head. The ladder leading up to it was missing several rungs, and the loft floor itself looked treacherous, a patchwork of darkness and rot. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to live only on the ground floor, and never tempt the unstable structure. But another, more practical part knew she couldn't. It might hold usable timber, or it might be burdened with tons of rotten hay whose weight was helping to pull the whole barn down. She had to know what was up there. After a short rest, she tested the ladder. It creaked alarmingly, but held her weight. She climbed slowly, testing each rung before trusting it. When she pulled herself up onto the loft floor, the wood groaned in protest. She moved with the light, careful steps of someone walking on thin ice. The air was even more stale up here, thick with the ghosts of 1,000 harvests. Most of the floorboards were soft, spongy with damp rot. But as she made her way to the far corner, the one directly above her newly claimed living space, her boot landed on a section of flooring that felt different. It was firm, solid. She stomped on it lightly. Instead of the dull, damp thud of the surrounding wood, it produced a hard, resonant, and distinctly hollow sound. Her curiosity piqued, she knelt down. Wiping away a thick layer of grime and ancient chaff, she saw it. The boards in this 4-foot square section were laid perpendicular to all the others. And the nails, when she looked closely, were not the square, rust-eaten heads of the originals. They were round, newer, and set with a precision that was completely out of place, amidst the surrounding decay. It was an anomaly, a single clear note of intention in a symphony of neglect. She didn't understand it, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it meant something. Days bled into a week. Fanny's life found a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the moment. Repair, salvage, fortify. She worked from dawn until dusk, her body aching, but her mind fiercely focused. The small corner of the barn began to feel less like a ruin and more like a refuge. She had managed to rig a makeshift stall for dust, and her own small space was now almost entirely sealed from the wind. She was thin and perpetually tired, but she was surviving. One afternoon, the sound of an approaching horse made her freeze, her hand on the handle of a rusty hatchet she'd found. A rider appeared in the great open doorway, silhouetted against the bright sun. "Fanny?" a familiar voice called. It was Jebediah Stone, a man who had worked for her father for 10 years. He was weathered and kind, with eyes that had seen her grow from a child into a young woman. He dismounted and walked in, his gaze taking in the patches on the wall, the neat stack of firewood, the quiet determination in her face. He didn't offer pity, he offered respect. "Heard you were out here," he said, his voice plain-spoken and warm. He unstrapped a heavy burlap sack from his saddle. "Figured you could use this." Inside was flour, salt pork, dried beans, and a small tin of coffee. Tucked beside it was a long, heavy piece of steel, a pry bar. "Your pa would be proud of the work you're doin'," Jeb said, his eyes meeting hers. "He always said you had more grit than any 2 boys in the county." The simple words of validation were more nourishing than the food he'd brought. After he left, the pry bar lay on the ground, a tool of immense potential. Fanny's thoughts, which had been consumed with survival, drifted back up to the hayloft, to the strange, solid floorboards and their newer nails. That evening, as a sliver of moon rose in the sky, she lit the lantern she'd painstakingly repaired. Dust watched from her stall, a silent, steady presence. Lantern in one hand and the heavy pry bar in the other, Fanny climbed the rickety ladder once more. The time for investigation had come. She knelt at the edge of the peculiar square of flooring. The solid thud it made when she tapped it was a question waiting for an answer. She wedged the sharp, flat end of the pry bar under the edge of the first board, right next to one of the out-of-place nails. She put her weight on it. The old wood groaned. The nail screeched in protest, a sharp metallic cry in the quiet barn. Then, with a sudden crack, the board lifted. It wasn't nailed to the joist below. It was part of a lid. The discovery sent a jolt through her, a mixture of fear and electrifying curiosity. The single lifted board revealed not the dark space between joists she expected, but the edge of a carefully constructed, lead-lined cavity. Her heart began to beat a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was no accident of construction. This was a secret. Working with a focused intensity, she used the pry bar to loosen the other boards. They had been fitted together with tongue and groove joints, designed to come away as a single unit. With a final heaving grunt of effort, the entire 4x4-foot section of flooring lifted free, revealing a hidden compartment set deep between the massive oak beams of the loft. She held the lantern lower, its golden light spilling into the shallow space. The first thing she saw were dozens of small, drawstring pouches made of soft leather, neatly arranged in rows. They were grimy with dust but otherwise perfectly preserved. She reached in, her hand trembling slightly, and picked one up. It was unexpectedly heavy, dense with a weight that didn't feel like coin. With fumbling fingers, she untied the leather cord at its neck and tipped the contents into her grimy palm. It wasn't gold coins, it was dust, a coarse, glittering, unmistakably yellow powder that shimmered in the lantern light. Gold dust. She opened another pouch and another. They were all the same. A fortune in raw gold, hidden away in the floor of a forgotten barn. The sheer value of it was staggering, enough to buy back her family's ranch 10 times over. But beneath the last layer of pouches lay something else. A large, flat parcel wrapped in oilcloth and twine. It was this that made her blood run cold. The gold was wealth, but this felt different. It felt like knowledge. Carefully, she lifted the heavy package out of the compartment. She set it on the floorboards beside her and worked at the knots with her fingernails. The twine broke, and she unfolded the stiff, waxy cloth. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger book. It was the kind used for keeping accounts, its cover plain and unmarked. She opened it. The first page was filled with neat, spidery handwriting. At the top was a date from 5 years prior. The page was a list of cattle brands, but they were drawn in a strange way. A simple B for Boone had lines added to it, transforming it into a complex, stylized SC. A neighboring rancher's was similarly altered. Page after page, it was the same. A systematic record of how to alter the brands of nearly every small rancher in the county into the unmistakable mark of Silas Croft. Next to each altered brand were dates, cattle counts, and figures listed in ounces and grams. Payments. This wasn't just a book of brands. It was a rustler's ledger. It was a detailed, damning account of how Silas Croft had systematically stolen the herds of his neighbors, bleeding them dry until they were forced to default on the very loans he had so generously extended. Her father's brand was in the book, listed a dozen times. She saw the Miller brand, too, the man who had built this barn. The rustlers, paid in gold dust from this secret cache, had used this collapsing structure as their bank and their office. Croft hadn't just outmaneuvered her father in business. He had orchestrated his ruin from the shadows, a thief hiding behind a gentleman's suit. The truth was heavier than all the gold in the world. Just as the full, sickening weight of the discovery settled upon her, the wind outside changed its tune. The gentle sighing through the walls deepened into a low, menacing howl. A flicker of lightning illuminated the barn's interior in a stark, blue-white flash, followed a moment later by a deep, rumbling growl of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. A plains thunderstorm, sudden and violent, was bearing down on them. Fanny's first instinctual act was not to seek shelter for herself, but to protect the evidence. With frantic haste, she swept the gold pouches back into the hidden compartment, placing the oilcloth-wrapped ledger on top. She lowered the heavy lid back into place, the wood fitting so perfectly it was nearly invisible again. Her secret was safe. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. Rain came down not in drops but in solid sheets, hammering against the old wood. The wind shrieked, and the entire barn groaned and shuddered around her. The section of roof she hadn't yet managed to repair began to give way, water pouring into the main part of the barn. But her small fortified corner held. She and Dust were dry, an island of relative calm in the heart of the tempest. Suddenly, above the roar of the storm, she heard another sound. A human sound. A desperate cry for help, quickly snatched away by the wind. Peering through a crack in the wall, she saw it. A wagon, overturned in the mud of the track that ran past her property. One of its wheels shattered. A lantern lay flickering in the deluge nearby. Without a second thought, Fanny grabbed her own lantern and plunged out into the storm. The wind and rain tore at her, but the fire of purpose in her belly was hotter than the storm was cold. She reached the wagon to find a young woman, soaked and shivering, trying to shelter a small, crying child under the wreckage. Their horse stood nearby, hobbling, a leg clearly injured. "Come with me," Fanny yelled over the gale. She helped the woman, who introduced herself as Mary, and carried the little boy back to the barn. She led them into her small, dry corner, the only sanctuary for miles. She gave them her one blanket, stirred up the embers in the small, makeshift fire pit she'd built, and shared the last of the coffee Jeb had brought her. She then went back out into the maelstrom to tend to their injured horse, leading it into the relative shelter of the main barn. All night, as the storm raged, the three of them huddled together. Mary was terrified, but Fanny felt a strange, profound calm. She was no longer just a girl surviving. She was a woman with a purpose, protecting not only her own future, but the lives of strangers. The barn was no longer a ruin. It was an ark. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and silent. The sky was a pale, bruised purple. As the first rays of sun touched the plains, a group of riders appeared on the horizon, moving slowly through the mud. It was a search party from Redemption, led by Mary's husband. Their relief and astonishment at finding his family safe, warm, and dry inside the infamous Miller ruin was absolute. The husband, a blacksmith named Thomas, wrung Fanny's hand. His eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. He and the other men looked around at the patched walls, the neat stall, the evidence of hard work and ingenuity. They looked at Fanny not as the town charity case, but as something else entirely, a force to be reckoned with. The story of the rescue spread through Redemption before Fanny even set foot back in town. When she did, later that morning, the whispers that followed her were different. The pity was gone, replaced by a grudging, then growing respect. People nodded to her on the street. The woman at the mercantile gave her a small bag of apples on credit. The social weather had shifted. Fanny walked directly to the land office, the heavy ledger wrapped in its oilcloth under her arm. Mr. Abernathy looked up, surprised to see her. She said nothing, simply placed the ledger on his desk and opened it to a page bearing her father's altered brand. She then placed a single, heavy pouch of gold dust beside it. Mr. Abernathy stared at the page. He traced the lines of the altered brand with a shaking finger. He was a man of records and rules, and he understood immediately what he was seeing. He looked from the book to Fanny's steady, waiting face, and back again. The color drained from his own. This is his handwriting," he whispered, referring to Croft. He had seen it on 100 deeds and loan documents. He looked up at Fanny, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. "All these years," he murmured. Without another word, he closed the ledger, stood up, and locked the door of his office. "Wait here, Miss Boone," he said, his voice now crisp and official. "I'm sending a wire to the U.S. Marshal in Hayes City." The arrival of the Marshal a few days later was a public spectacle. He, along with Mr. Abernathy and Fanny, walked directly to Silas Croft's sprawling office above the bank. Croft blustered and threatened, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. He denied everything, calling Fanny a liar and a thief. But when the Marshal opened the ledger, Croft fell silent. The evidence was irrefutable. His own neat handwriting, a witness against him. The book contained the names of the rustlers he'd employed. Men who, when faced with the Marshal's grim authority, quickly confessed in exchange for leniency. The town of Redemption gathered in the street, watching in stunned silence as Silas Croft, the man who had owned their town in all but name, was led away in irons. They turned as one to look at Fanny Boone, standing quietly by the Marshal's horse. The laughter was gone. The mockery was gone. In its place was a profound, silent awe. The seasons turned. Summer's oppressive heat gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The change in the weather was mirrored by the change in Fanny's life and in the barn itself. The news of Croft's downfall and the restitution of stolen assets to the wronged families had made Fanny a local legend. The ranchers whose names she had cleared from the ledger came to her, one by one, not with pity, but with offers of help. The blacksmith, Thomas, whose wife and child she had saved, forged new hinges for the great doors. Other men, armed with hammers, saws, and stacks of fresh lumber, arrived to help her rebuild. What had been a community effort of scorn became a community effort of construction. They raised a new roof, solid and sound. They replaced the missing planks, milling the wood themselves. They shored up the foundation and laid a new, level floor on the ground level. The barn was transformed. It stood straight and proud against the Kansas sky. No longer a skeleton, but a handsome, sturdy structure, its new wood smelling of pine and possibility. Fanny. worked alongside them every day, her hands calloused but her spirit light. The gold dust provided the means, but the labor was a gift. It was the town's apology and its thanks. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and violet, Fanny stood in the wide, open doorway of her finished barn. The interior was clean and cavernous, no longer filled with shadows but with the soft, warm light of golden hour. Dust, her mare, was now glossy and well-fed, content in a newly fenced paddock beside the barn. Jeb Stone rode up, dismounting to stand beside her. He looked at the barn, then at Fanny. Her face was still weathered, but the deep lines of grief around her eyes had softened. She looked peaceful. "You got your justice, Fanny," Jeb said quietly, "and your father's name is clean again." Fanny looked out at the vast expanse of the prairie, the grasses waving like a silent sea. She looked at the solid walls around her, at the strength of the beams above. She held up her hands, no longer the hands of a grieving daughter, but the hands of a builder. "I paid $3 for a barn, Jeb," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of everything she had endured and overcome. "I think I built a home." She had found more than gold, more than justice. She had found her place, not by inheriting it, but by raising it from the dust with her own two hands. Thank you for joining us on this journey to the heart of the plains. It's a story that reminds us that true inheritance is the strength we find in ourselves. If you were moved by Fanny's story, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more tales of quiet courage. We'll see you next time.